I'm Barrie Cassidy.
And I'm Tony Barrie.
Welcome to Back Barries, a Guardian Australia podcast. And this week, in front of a live audience of some 440 people at Federation Square in Melbourne. And it's It's a joint exercise with the Wheeler Centre, and we're just so delighted to have people here in such large numbers. Well, the Liberal Party has a new leader, Susan Lee, but the vote was tight, probably too close for comfort. We'll get to that after we have a look at what's going on in the government. And there are still a couple of seats in doubt, but I think we can say their numbers, certainly around the election result, Tony, are comfortable. It could be something like 93 Labor, 43 Coalition, and maybe 13 crossbenchers. Anthony Albanese, in his humble way, has reminded us a couple of times it's the biggest Labor caucus ever. That's a hell of a lot of political capital.
Yep, it's a lot of people to manage on the backbench. Sometimes that's not as easy as it sounds. Lots of mouths to feed. But some of the results are really extraordinary the more you dig into it. Because normally in federal elections, as you well know, Barrie, like 53% is a landslide. So Rudd was 52.7. I think Abbott was 53 and a bit. I think Howard hit 54. Well, I think the last count I saw, it's 54.9, 2PP. I mean, that's an extraordinary result, especially for a government that's already served one term. So a lot of these big, 53% margins happened when it was a mood for change. So that's one extraordinary statistic. The other extraordinary statistic is the Coalition only holds 10 urban seats in Australia. Labor holds 70. Now, given that Australia is such a highly urbanised country, that's, it makes them very, very uncompetitive. The other fascinating thing, which we'll talk about during the night, no doubt, is the Senate. The Coalition did not win a third spot in any state, first time in history. Labor have actually picked up...
not in a single state?
Nope, we lost David Fawcett, the Holly Hughes, the person who's effectively replacing her.
That was a reflection of what went on in the House. They absolutely knew what they were doing then when they went into the polling booth.
Yeah, it was real intent in the way how the public voted. But that also makes it very interesting because this will be a Senate where, for the first time since Rudd Gillard, where the government only needs to deal with the Greens. So instead of having to deal with a hodgepodge of crossbenchers and trying to cobble together a compromise, they only need to deal with the Greens. And where the Greens go on this and whether they decide that not to be, perfect is the enemy of the good, and whether they decide to be pragmatic is going to be, I think, fascinating to watch this term.
Albanese has done something a little different. He's come up with a slogan immediately after the election. And it's progressive patriotism. He says of that's doing things the Australian way. That's kind of picking up on the theme that was a kind of a shorthand way of saying we're not going to go down Donald Trump's pathway. We're doing our own thing in Australia. Progressive patriotism.
Yeah, he can read the play, can't he? He knows that there'll be a rump within the coalition that want to sort of pivot to Trump and Trumpian politics, and there'll be another, basically, half the party room that wants to try and move to the centre. And so he sees a wedge opportunity, and you never look a gift wedge in the mouth.
Yeah, that's right. He did say too that he's talking about diversity and how diversity enriches Australia, and that's by extension a comment on the immigration debate, I guess. But he is a naturally cautious person, even with a whopping majority. So it's really a question of just how brave he will be. Ellen Kohler wrote an interesting piece during the week where he's saying that first of all, is Anthony Albanese up for reform? Is Jim Chalmers a risk-taker like Paul Keating was? Because the point he made is that Paul Keating was able to take risks because Bob Hawke was popular, and Bob Hawke had the majority, and then Keating surfed in off that to an extent. And then are the reforms needed? And of course there was a big yes to that. So this is the opportunity. This is the 3 years. It's the best opportunity he's going to have to do some of the tough things.
So my view always is every Prime Minister wants a legacy. They'll deny it, but they all do it. Hawke, I think, was the ultimate legacy, project guy. But they've all wanted a legacy of some sort. Those who know Albanese well say he probably doesn't, which I find a little bit hard to believe. I think if he was going to have one legacy, universal childcare will be one thing that he wants to do. Raise the rate might be another one. These are all very expensive. But if they're going to find money, I think it'll be for those two. But, I mean, you know Albanese pretty well. Do you think he's a legacy guy or just wants to be known for winning elections?
I think he's cautious.
Yeah.
But there'll be things he'll want to do, and he'll be hearing it loud and clear from a lot of people. But I did hear a report on Sky that suggested they've already ruled out doing anything around misinformation and disinformation, bringing that legislation back. That troubles me because that is one of the great threats to democracy. It's too easy these days to mislead people, and if they're just throwing their hands up and saying that's too hard, that's not encouraging. On issues like gambling advertising, that's going to be another test for them. But whenever you ask them about it, they say, what we will be doing reform, but it will be around things that we want to do, like aged care, childcare, climate change initiatives and so on, and that's great. But they don't mention taxation policy. They don't mention it, and yet something has to be done to make the taxation system fairer, particularly to young people, and start to redress some of that imbalance. But I wouldn't hold my breath on it. On the new ministry, and they've pretty much done, I think, in AFL terms, they've kept the key position players in their places.
Yep.
To go through the list of the key portfolios: Foreign Affairs, Defence, Treasurer, Finance, Health, Education, Home Affairs, Climate Change and Energy. All of them, the same minister as the first term. So that's a 6-year stability in those key places. So again, this is typical Albanese. He really does like things to be under control.
Yeah, I think, you know, he is not what you call a brave politician. And I think, you know, this is part of his challenges. He's been there for 25 odd years and he's still largely undefined. You know, most politicians who've been around for a long time, you know what they're about. You know what's important to them. Howard was always about tax cuts and helping families or middle class welfare and IR. Albanese lacks that definition. But I think he's got to be careful, despite this thumping majority, is he doesn't really have a second-term agenda. He didn't really have a first-term agenda. And obviously they've got the tax cuts, the $5 tax cuts, but he's going to need a lot more than that. And I think the obvious one is social policy. Economic reform is very difficult. I'm not sure they've got the appetite for that. But with the Greens, there's an opportunity there, Labor being a left-wing controlled caucus now and left-wing controlled leadership. I can see them saying to the Greens, there will never be a better time to get through these reforms that you want, whether it be a sugar tax or alcohol regulation reform or so forth. So I think a lot of these so-called unpopular industries are going to be in the gun, and there might be a few things like universal childcare. Well,
Larissa Waters, who's the new leader of the Greens, was asked today what she wants to see happen over the next 3 years, and she said we'll support the government to get some shit done in the Senate. So at least she's making the right sounds. But the thing about the ministry this time around, and it's been creeping up on us for a while, but there was a time when you had a cabinet and then you had an outer ministry. Now you've got a cabinet of 23, an outer ministry of 7, and now there are 12 assistants, and then on top of that there are 7 special envoys, total 49. The special envoys is interesting because that's a new thing, and I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing in one respect, because you can be a special envoy for the Indian Ocean, they call it, but it's not actually the ocean, it's those who live around the ocean, I presume, and homelessness and the arts and so on. So it enables the government, I think, to go out and talk to the advocates in those areas, because the ministers are busy and sometimes they can't reach them. So they will reach a lot more people. They'll take the government story to these people, but they'll also listen a lot. So I can see, but it's getting kind of to the ridiculous stage, isn't it? Like 49.
Yeah, but he does have 120 mouths to feed. That's one of the downsides of winning in such a landslide. The Senate as well as the reps. Senate, yeah, 26 senators probably. 28. Counting, they haven't pressed the button yet, but it's looking anywhere between 28, 29 for Labor, plus 93 House of Reps. That's a lot of mouths to feed. It's a lot of people to keep happy, and you don't want 70 unhappy backbenchers, ambitious backbenchers, especially if they're in the Senate. My experience has shown whenever there's leadership instability, it always comes from the upper house because they've got nothing else to do. They've got no, mate, they don't have constituents, and so they just sit on the phone all day and they just talk to one another and they talk to people like, your old job. I mean, was that your experience? Or?
Yeah, pretty much. The thing about that too, it doesn't stop at 49 because then there are all sorts of other jobs that raises you above the position of backbencher. The whips,
Yep.
Speaker, Deputy Speaker, Deputy President. Then they start carving up chairs of committee. There'll be two people on the backbench, Ed Husick and Mark Dreyfus. I mean, the way...
No, the coalition's worse because there'll be a total of 69 probably, senators and MPs, 42 shadow ministries, plus Deputy Speaker and Deputy President, plus the whips. There's only going to be about 18 people on the backbench. Again, if you're one of those 18, you're never going to be in a great mood. You're going to feel like, why are these other 52 bozos ahead of me? Management of the backbench is a tough challenge. And, of course, I don't think we've moved past that disease which came from the New South Wales Labor right of nicking your leaders all the time. I know this sounds ridiculous given Albanese's thumping win, but, who would have thought after Rudd's win and Abbott's win that they'd sort of revisit that? The Victorian Liberal Party, of course, does it, over the Christmas break. So I suspect it's, even with his thumping majority, there is a risk.
With the Mark Dreyfus, Ed Husick thing, the worst thing about the Mark Dreyfus thing is that he actually went to them when Bill Shorten left and there was going to be a reshuffle, and he said, look, do you want me to stick around? And the message he got was yes. So he stuck around to be humiliated after the election. Ed Husick, of course, hasn't missed him since. He said that he blamed it all on Richard Marles. Essentially, he's the head of the Victorian right faction, and said that he's Deputy Prime Minister, he should be a statesman and not a factional assassin. And I have some sympathy for that. When I was working for Hawke, we had a factional assassin, and that was Graham Richardson. And you would never put him in a leadership position. No. For that reason. He was the guy who did this kind of nasty stuff. And I take their point on that. And now, of course, Nikki Sava in the Nine Papers has got the response from the New South Wales right. And she reports that they tried to save him, and that this is the New South Wales right of people like Tony Burke and Chris Bowen and so on. And they claimed that he was dumped for no good reason. They weren't happy. They thought natural attrition should have taken care of it. But then they said, according to Nikki, if they proceed, this will be an act of self-harm. It will create considerable ill will inside the party, and the Islamic community will never forgive them. And then when I did my own checking on this today, not that I need to check Nikki, but I did, and they said, and you did see the point, there would be retribution. Now, this would have been a much bigger story if it hadn't been for what was going on the other side of politics. It sort of camouflaged the extent of this. But retribution, you're talking here about the New South Wales right faction taking retribution against the Victorian right faction. That's when factions get a bit messy.
Yeah, I mean, I love Nikki, but I think this is also one for the sports fans. I think we were all very excited about it and what's happened, but I think Labor are particularly good at next person up. Sam Ray, for example, is the future. He's a highly talented fellow. And so they're always thinking, they do this in Victorian state politics, how do we keep a good core team together so we can sort of remain incredibly competitive. Whereas the Liberal Party, we've got people who've been there for 20, 30 years. I mean, Russell Broadbent, the former member for Monash, he's a lovely fellow, Russell. But, when we were researching the 1990 federal campaign, and I was looking at all the MPs, and he's the only one, he was there in 1990. So, I mean, Russell was there when I was listening to, Flock of Seagulls at university. And Liberal Party are not as skilled at thinking about, well, where are the next Peter Costellos and Peter Reefs and these sort of people, where are they?
On the Liberal leadership, and it was, as I said before, too close for comfort really, 29-25. I think it's particularly difficult for Susan Lee for this reason. It wasn't about just two personalities. It wasn't about Angus Taylor versus Susan Lee. It was really a battle for the heart and soul of the Liberal Party and the direction that they'll take from now on. Angus Taylor kind of represents those who believe that they lost because they became too Labor light, not because they're away on some right-wing fantasy. It was because of that, whereas Susan Lee says, no, we need to be a more centrist party. So because they were voting to an extent on that direction that they wanted the party to be taken in. That's a tough one.
It is, but sometimes, the leadership ballots can be deceptive. Abbott only beat Turnbull by one vote, and he went on to become Prime Minister. And of course, Fran Bailey didn't turn up to that ballot, and somebody wrote no, presumably about for either candidate offering. So that was a Pyrrhic victory. And then you look at the late Simon Crean, he beat Beazley 58-34, and the poor fellow never got to take the party to an election. So they can be deceptive, these results, but your broader point, though, about how there's a battle for the heart and soul of the Liberal Party is certainly relevant. And there's an identity crisis in the party, and I'm not sure whether they're sort of working out what those values are that binds them, and the shared values with the electorate is going to be critically important.
You mentioned that Abbott beat Turnbull by one vote, and I recall saying on the ABC that was nowhere near enough. Right? That doesn't resolve a thing because it shows that half the room are against you. And I walked out and one of the Liberal ministers at the time had a real go at me and said, God, you're a miserable lot at the ABC. And I said, well, that's just my feeling. Down the track, Turnbull beat Abbott by 10 votes.
Yes.
And so a close vote does demonstrate that, in a sense, you're delaying the inevitable. When I was working for Bob Hawke and Paul Keating was coming after him, and there was going to be a leadership challenge, the first one, I was gone by the second one, just to put that on the record. But the first one, Bob Hawke said to me, could you go up to the gallery and talk to some of the leading characters up there and find out what sort of a margin I need so that I can put him away, that all this speculation will go away. I thought, well, that's an interesting exercise. So I went up there. I spoke to Laurie Oakes, and Laurie is too smart for that. Laurie just said, yeah, thanks, mate, but I think I'll keep my flexibility around that question. But I eventually did speak to enough of them, and the consensus was 60-40 would pretty much do it. Hawke won that 66-44. So I went back and I informed him of this. After the ballot, I went back a second time, a day or two later. I suspect Graham Richardson got there before I did, because their mood had changed completely. Oh, no, that's not enough. No, 66-44, there'll be another challenge. And of course, they were right, but it just shows you that you need decisive numbers if you really want to lead with a bit of confidence and surety.
Well, but these days, and particularly in the Liberal Party, but both parties are applicable, you only really need 25%. The challenger might not win, but the challenge will. Because these days, there's no internal consequences for your behaviour. And you said before, Graham Richardson would sort of do the hard yards.
Yep.
But those people weren't rewarded accordingly. These days, you can clearly undermine a leader on the record or off the record, and most people who are off the record leave very muddy footprints. George Brandis always used to leave Greek and Roman mythology off the record quotes, which was pretty obvious it was George. Christopher Pine, my old boss, would leave 1970s references. Poseidon Adventure was a favourite of his. But I think these days, everybody knows who does a lot of this leaking, and mate, they'll end up in a very senior portfolio. So, and I think that's a massive problem for the Liberal Party internally. Is that as long as you've got a small rump who's prepared to tear you down, they'll succeed.
And after the vote, of course, within 24 hours, not one but two MPs had spoken of their ambitions to lead the Liberal Party one day. I mean, that again is virtually unprecedented. One of them was Andrew Hastie, and the other being Jacinta Price. And it's it's going to be interesting now with her because there is a theory going around. I tend to accept it that Taylor might have lost himself the leadership by bringing her over. He only needed 2 or 3 votes to go the other way, and he was the leader. And those upset by bringing her across from the National Party might have made the difference. And now, since then, there's these stories that she was going to run as the deputy, and then when he lost, she chickened out, as one MP put it. It's going to be a difficult relationship now, isn't it, for her inside the party? She let some of them down because she didn't run when she said she would, and the others resent the fact that she was there anyway.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges for Liberal Party is because media has become so tribal these days, across the whole spectrum, and our branch members love Sky After Dark. It's their newsletter, and they are incredibly influential over pre-selections and over our membership. And, you know, I spoke to a fairly senior Liberal MP. I was up in Canberra, and he said, "Mate, I've got to go. I've got to watch Sky After Dark." And I was like, "What are you watching that for?" And he was like, "Mate, I've got to find out what my branch members are being told." He said, "You know,"
Right, yeah.
He said, I get back to my electorate and go to my branch meetings, and I've discovered that, you know, for the last 2 weeks they've been told this particular issue. So they've become highly influential, and that is driving a lot of our membership vote. And so, you know, that influences our pre-selections and the quality of people we can choose.
And doesn't that make it harder now for Susan Lee to try and abandon some of the policies that she might judge hurt them during the campaign? For example, the nuclear energy policy, when that is the true nature of the branches. The branches are quite right-wing and they're older. So how does she walk that fine line? She's got to abandon something along the way so that she can present herself as a new face of the party with a different look.
Yeah. When it comes to the point before about, you know, it's not just leadership. We've always got this messiah complex in the Liberal Party. There's this great, Troy Bramston wrote this great biography of Menzies, I'm sure it was Troy, where he had this vignette about how Menzies, in between his 2 terms as Prime Minister, there was a move to bring Don Bradman, who had retired from cricket, to be his Liberal leader. And there was another wonderful vignette about how Casey, the MP, took this news to Menzies and said, you know, there's a move to replace you. And Menzies said, why? And he said, well, there's a view that you don't suffer fools. And Menzies reported to have said, well, what am I doing now? You know, this guy sort of slunk out. But this messiah complex has been with the Liberal Party for forever. It's not just now. And it's not just up to Susan or Angus or whoever the leader is. It's up to the party room. And we talked before about the internal consequences for bad behaviour. It doesn't exist anymore. So they've all got to take ownership of it and make it work, because if they just try and sort of this battle for the heart and soul, winner-takes-all mentality, you know, the problem now is almost structural and cultural of the Liberal Party. This idea that it's cyclical in politics, that you hang around for 2 or 3 terms and your time will come. The Liberal Party will be so weakened culturally and structurally that they won't be able to compete.
The other thing that Susan Lee has to do, of course, is keep the coalition together. I'm not suggesting that they will split, but it's a live issue. And there are a couple of things the Nationals will want. They will want a bigger representation, because proportionally now they have more a right to that. They did better than the Liberals in the election. And the other thing is that on the key issues, that they can go their own way on some issues, of course, but on key issues, and particularly around climate change, around zero emissions and so on, she's going to have to get them on board, isn't she?
The Nats always do this, though. It's their, you know, trade-off, and because they always know the Liberal leadership will stand in and not allow the split to happen, because they simply cannot win. It's been since Federation. Like, you know, you need a coalition. You can't win individually. So they have to, but also the National Party has to realise that, you know, the point we made before, most seats are in urban centres, and the coalition owns 10. Labor owns 70. So unless they can compete in those urban centres, and Matt Canavan sort of said, you know, they need to focus more on the regions. Well, that's not the pathway to government. And I think, you know, these internal trade-offs and compromise are really important. People, I love Margaret Thatcher, but I think she was wrong when she said compromise means you stand for nothing. You do need these internal trade-offs. In the same way that I think urban MPs appreciate that regional MPs, regional centres have taken on the burden of economic change, and they need to be compensated. I think in the same way, regional MPs need to appreciate that urban centres have their own set of challenges and problems.
Yeah, it's urban versus regional. The fact is, though, the Liberal Party now has a regional leader, a leader from the regions. They haven't had one of those since Malcolm Fraser, and yet her challenge is to win seats back in the cities. And I'm sure the Nats will be reminding her of that. And they have to win back the female vote and the young vote.
Yeah, the Liberal Party only leads in over 65 and multiple asset class owners. So unless we means test the vote and raise the legal age to 65, we can't compete. Okay, just on that, you could change the system, I suppose. People are now saying, well, the preferential system is what done it. They seem to forget that from Malcolm Fraser, from Bob Menzies all the way through to Malcolm Fraser, or before Malcolm Fraser, until 1972, they had 23 unbroken years under the preferential system. I don't think it was the system. No, it's the stupidest whataboutism journalism there is, because that's not the system they're competing in. And if it was first past the post, Paul Erickson, the Labor Party campaign director, and Andrew Hurst, the coalition one, would have run totally different campaigns. The fact is they're running to win 76 seats or more. And that, it was the same argument when Beazley won the popular vote in 98, my old boss, Linton Crosby, Sir Linton Crosby.
Yes.
The same argument was said, and he said, well, but that wasn't the contest. The contest was 76 seats.
Yeah, I think they're saying they would have won as many as 85 seats rather than 93 or 94, whatever it is, had it been first past the post. So it wouldn't have made a great deal of difference. But it's a question of really be careful of what you wish for, because for Conservatives in Australia to say they prefer first past the post, they should just have a look at what happened in Britain. And that was an extraordinary result. Labor went from 209 seats to 411 in a 650-seat parliament with a 1.6% swing. They virtually doubled their numbers. 34% of the popular vote, 411 seats. And on the other side, the Liberal Democrats got 72 seats with 12% of the vote, and the Reform UK, Farage's party, got 5 seats with 14% of the vote. So I don't think Britain was a good example of first past the post as an idea.
Yeah, obviously voluntary voting, so you're sort of harder to energise and mobilise, your supporters, and those that are sort of indifferent don't turn up at all. But look, there's merits in first past the post, but it's a totally nonsensical argument to sort of say, woulda, shoulda, coulda, and so I think they need to move on and look at that. How does the Liberal Party compete? I think Labor has been working towards this preference strategies for decades. And they've done it very, very well. And
just an explanation too as to why these votes, the result drags on. The seat of Cornwall in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, Broadmeadows and Craigieburn and so on, is a classic example. It's not because the Australian Electoral Commission is not throwing all the resources at it and getting more people to come in and count them. Because of the preferential system, you start from the bottom and then the preferences, you eliminate people as their preferences are counted. You can't do that until you've got all of the primary votes in to know what order they finish in. And so they have to wait for the postal votes, and they give them 2 weeks for the postal votes to come from overseas and elsewhere. So you get this delay. It's just, there's nothing you can do about that. If everybody's vote counts and their primary vote counts, then you have to wait until they come in. And it's only where there's a bit of a gap and you know that the running order won't change, that you can count the preferences and declare the seats. Okay, questions?
What do you think the role of Advance was in this election campaign, and where do you think it's going to go in the future?
My view is they're like your mate that turns up to help you paint the house after you've already painted, and crack open a six-pack. Geez, that was good. And it's like, there's actually no evidence. I mean, we're in the field all the time, quantitatively and qualitatively. There's no evidence they've had any impact on any result at all. They're very good at claiming they had. And they do a lot of their fundraising down at the Australia Club with rich donors. They're a massive problem for the Liberal Party because they take away donors and money and volunteers who are energised by their agenda. And so it further weakens the Liberal Party. They think they're helping out, but they're not.
Next question.
Have the Liberal Party sought religious groups as membership to boost their membership? And if they have, or are they still continuing that strategy, if it is happening?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of different thinking about what should happen. I mean, obviously in America, there's no membership fee. You're just a registered supporter, which broadens your membership base. And I think there's a lot of merit in that because, the electorates and the candidates they choose, people need to be able to see themselves in the candidates. So I think whilst we probably don't have critical mass to do a primaries type campaign in Australia, that kind of fundamental principle, I think, has a lot of merit. So that there's more people choosing rather than a ever diminishing pool of members. Because some of these seats, state seats in particular, they'll only have 3 branches. So if you control 2 of those, you walk in, no drama. I mean, you can basically stack them out with family and a couple of close friends, work colleagues.
There's a couple over here.
Hello, I'm a bit short, so I'll stand up. I recently heard Jeff Kennett on ABC Radio Melbourne saying he was happy that Tim Wilson was in the race and because he could be a good attack dog. So this is a 2-part question. One, why ABC Radio Melbourne feel like a redundant Liberal Premier needs commentary, but that said, who could be the attack dog, if that's necessary, for the Labor Party?
Tim Wilson. Look, the one thing I say about Tim, which you've got to give him credit for, is he speaks his mind. Like, he doesn't hide away from his values. And a lot of politicians I know privately on Labor and Liberal side what they think, but they won't say it publicly. Tim will, and I think he gets some reward from that. I think in Goldstein, he did a lot of public forums. He was the only one talking about nuclear energy. No one else had. Everybody else is. Barrie noted, Dutton didn't go and do any press conferences. Here on this site, we're going to build a nuclear reactor. It's going to go all the way down to that creek down there and into that lake. He didn't do any. He visited about 50 bloody petrol stations, but Tim went and spoke in his electorate about nuclear energy as an important low emissions energy source. And whether you agree with them or not, that takes a bit of courage. And I think people will reward you for that. I mean, you look at the likes of Daniel Andrews and John Howard and others, the most common thing we get in focus groups is, I'm not sure I like him, but I know what he stands for. And that's important. That's really important because these days they just don't see much differentiation between the leaders. And despite his crushing win, Albanese still remains a bit undefined, and I'm not trying to take anything away from his historic win, but he's still got that problem where people don't really know what he stands for, which is why you can get some inertia in this term, and inertia turns into bad numbers, and that drags your primary vote down.
What did the Libs do to appeal to younger voters?
What do the Libs do to appeal to younger voters?
What do they do? Yeah, well, it just seems now that the youth vote, that is the vote between the youth vote. It's the vote between sort of 18 and 34 is running at about 64% for Labor these days. And that is a hell of a challenge to first of all identify how it came to that and how you reverse it. And I don't know, in a sense, why they are so loyal to the Labor Party when there's not a lot being done for them. The one policy initiative that I think would have made a difference this time was on the HEX initiative. But that's only a percentage of young people who benefit from that. The taxation system is biased against them. There's no doubt about it. and they faced challenges that our generation did not. When you just compare buying a house now is 10 times, you need 10 times your income now that you had in the 70s and 80s. So I don't know what it is, especially about them, but I think that what a lot of young people just immediately it's confronting for them is when they get around to cultural issues and when they talk about some of the issues around Indigenous Australia and some of the issues around climate change. They can smell that issue a mile off, that if you're faking on climate change, they'll pick it up. And so there are those kind of issues, I suppose, that is where they're more likely to be supportive of Labor than the Conservatives. But it's one thing to see these numbers, Tony. It's another to then map out a plan and start clawing some of them back.
Yeah, there's never one silver bullet, but I think housing is the political fault line in Australia. It's not just that younger cohort, it's their parents, it's their grandparents. It's parents in our focus groups who talk about, I'd love to help my kids out, but I'm just not sure my superannuation can withstand it. I've just got to be careful in case there's another Trumpian type, crazy policy announcement that crashes the share market. So, it is the number one issue because it is interrelated to cost of living. And what we found was interesting. We actually asked head-to-head who has the better policy for housing, Peter Dutton, the Coalition, or Anthony Albanese and Labor, or neither. Neither will work was the option. Neither will work was the highest number by far, which speaks to this deep cynicism in the electorate about housing. So I think, they do feel economically, we do focus groups with Gen Z all the time. My business partners like when I do it because they watch and laugh at me struggling because I'm spiritually a boomer. So so I get very sort of frustrated. But when you're talking about my business partner, Cos, looked into this, the top 30 electorates with Gen Z as a proportion of voters, top 30, the Coalition only has 4. Of the top 30 millennial, which is Gen Y, Gen Z, with tertiary qualifications, the Coalition only has 3 out of 30. So they just cannot compete unless they can start. In the Howard era, they never used to win the younger vote, but they were somewhat competitive. At the moment, their primary vote is in the low 20s, and you just can't compete, especially as that cohort grows. As you would have read, they made up the bulk of the voters this time.
And just on that as well, it's young women more so than young men that are part of that are supporting Labor in elections. But The Guardian had a piece recently too pointing out that young men just the same in Australia are resisting the kind of support that young men in the United States and in Europe are giving to the more right-wing parties. So there's so they're not voting at the same measure, but they are resisting that kind of stuff that Trump serves up.
In a post-COVID era, it seems like most Australians don't care too much about debt and structural deficits. Do you see this ever changing, and what does that mean for the Liberal Party as so-called better economic managers?
Yeah, during this election campaign, it was the first time that I saw a poll anywhere. I don't know whether it showed up at Redbridge, Tony, that Labor actually hit the front on economic management. I think at one point in your was that in your polling or was that in research groups?
Yeah, that was
polling,
our polling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've kind of said that as an accepted thing for a while now, but it may no longer be the case.
The Liberal Party will never win by bricks and mortar issues on education and health, because there's always going to be a legacy lead that Labor enjoys on that. It's less than it used to be because people do look at the health system and think it's not great. But they do sort of the cuts message still works, as we saw at the last federal election. But in terms of getting back to the core fundamentals of Liberal policy, that economic narrative, they just haven't been in the contest for quite a few terms. ScoMo was very tactical, and I think Dutton replicated that by let's cheaper petrol in the outer suburbs will win those. Very tactical. one of my favourite quotes that I use all the time is Alistair Campbell, the legendary Tony Blair spinner, who used to say, tactically smart, strategically stupid, of the Conservatives before David Cameron took over and rewrote the narrative. But, you win on the tactics, like, cheaper petrol out of suburbs, but that broader narrative of what you're about. But the truth of it is, the Liberal Party can only compete when they have a better economic narrative, and that's going to have to entail economic reform, which no one wants to touch at the moment, because we're in structural deficit, as you pointed out. It's not Jim Chalmers' fault alone, because he inherited it, and that was pre-COVID. I think we were $75 billion in debt, $75 billion in deficit before COVID. So, and it's a great moral question, because it's not just about the here and now. It's money you're effectively taking from children and grandchildren, particularly if it's for services as opposed to capital. So, I think the coalition needs, this is an opportunity now to have those tough conversations. It's a very hard argument to prosecute, but it gets back to their core. And I think there is an appetite out there. People do know the economy needs desperate reform. They don't talk like Alan Kohler, with his fluidity, obviously, but they know that things need to be fixed.
And I think there's a distinction too between the surplus and the deficit. And with the surplus, the Labor government delivered 2 surpluses and then they didn't. And
which
now
is because of commodities, commodity prices,
and they're in deficit. But it didn't seem to matter that much. And in the whole scheme of things, if a $20 or $30 or $40 billion deficit in a $1 trillion economy, I mean, it's a kind of an imaginary figure in a sense, that whether you're just in surplus or just in deficit, it doesn't seem to matter as much as the overall deficit itself.
But I think because both sides have given up on that. So you look back at the 2019 election when Bill Shorten took, to his absolute credit, took an ambitious agenda and lost. And I think that has sort of made people go small target ever since. People are afraid of having those tough conversations, and nobody wants to sort of put forward a reform agenda. Now, there are many components to why Shorten lost. Maybe he was too ambitious. Maybe if he had half the agenda. But the consequence of that has been, in 2019, you might remember, like, they were all fighting to be responsible economic managers. And Shorten was projecting a surplus. That was only 6 years ago. Now no one even pretends. In fact, they almost use it as a weapon against each other. Like, they want to deliver a surplus. That's going to mean cuts. And so I think that's a real problem for Australian politics.
Yeah, when Bill Shorten, though, vowed to get rid of negative gearing altogether, and the coalition came back with him by saying that police, nurses, school teachers, a lot of people negatively gear a property. And had he said, I'm giving you heads up now, we've got a 10-year program to reduce negative gearing to, say, 5 properties. Something like that, a gradual decline in negative gearing. And then you're making a real difference, because you're making properties less attractive to investors. And that, in turn, would help young people. Yeah,
but he had a lot of other policies as well, franking credits, superannuation.
The franking credits one too was
and maybe the bullseye was too big. Maybe if he just had kept it to negative gearing and a couple other things. But we'll never know, the counterfactual. But, it was a loss in terms of public policy in this country, I think.
My question is about the long-term future of the Liberals and the Nationals as a political force. The DLP split from the Labor Party in the 1950s, and it took 17 years before Labor came back into power. Given that there's a deep ideological split within the LNP, could they also be facing that sort of period in the political wilderness?
Yeah. I think it was Peter Lewis wrote about this recently. He said that the Teals might be to the Liberal Party what the DLP was to Labor. And I think there's a lot of merit in that. And the Teals are sort of at the crossroads as well. They lost Goldstein, only just won Kooyong. So I think they now need to look at their longevity. How is their longevity best served? Is it to go to becoming local champions in their electorate who are seen to be good local MPs? Or is it to go to that sort of pedigree that they had last time of, the Don chip keeping the bastards honest, particularly on renewable energy? So they've got to make a strategic decision here, because I'm not sure their longevity is guaranteed. But yes, I mean, and I think Albanese will be smart. He'll give them a few big wins to make them relevant to their electorate, because he knows that they could be the DLP for the Liberal Party. So, and as I said, the problems in the Liberal Party is now structural and cultural, because you get to the point where you're so weakened, like Menzies, which is a seat I think it was created in 1983. It's always been Liberal, and we've lost it. Keith Wallahan was a great tragedy, a really good person who went into politics for the right reasons, took a massive haircut in income. But how would you convince anyone to run for that seat in the Liberal Party to take a year off work? You know, there's probably $100,000, $150,000 lost income and expenses, time away from your family, gruelling work, when there's really no guarantee that the campaign apparatus can deliver you a seat. And so consequently, I think the quality of candidates diminishes. And, you know, you always pick up someone like, I think Amelia Hamer was a quality candidate. But, you know, she had a trust fund, and I don't say it in a pejorative way. She could afford to do that. I mean, her CV is good, there's no denying that. Monique Ryan's CV is good. But, you know, you can't sort of just recruit these candidates unless they've got, you know, some support.
I think the comparison you make about the Teals and the DLP has some merit. The people who certainly voted for the Teals in the end were the moderate voters and I thought Scott Morrison's attitude and a lot of people around him, some office holders in the Liberal Party, their attitudes seem to be good riddance. And until they get over that and start finding ways to win them back, then they could take as long to shake off as the DLP that you mentioned. It took a long time to shake off the DLP. And that's the bad news. But the good news for the coalition is that once you do, and once you address that problem, then recovery can happen very quickly. And I mentioned on this podcast once before that in 1966, when Harold Holt had that massive victory, something like 56% of the two-party preferred vote, within 3 years, so Labor was at 44, within 3 years, from 66 to 69, they went to 50%. So once you solve your problems, once you work it out and you go to work on it, you can recover very quickly. So it was 50-50 in 1969, but a couple of things happened that were quite significant, and I'm not suggesting they'll happen again. One, the Vietnam War ended, took that out of the discussion, so that certainly helped the Labor Party, and Whitlam emerged, and they had a really energising and powerful leader to get behind them. So you need some significant things to happen to recover quickly. It happens at the state level. It happens at a ridiculous extent at the state level.
Victoria.
Yeah, well, in Queensland, where the party went from they said it was going to be a cricket team, it ended up being a netball team, and they won the next election. So it can happen at the state level. We haven't seen it happen at the federal level, except for the 66 to 69.
Campbell Newman contributed to that result, must be said. But then you look at the Victorian Liberal Party, where there's no sign that they're reforming or changing their ways, and there's 37 seats federally in Victoria. Coalition has 6. The Nats own 3, so 9 out of 37 seats. Mathematically, you cannot get to 76 seats out of 150 if you can't compete in Victoria.
Yep.
You mentioned before about the need for economic reform. We're in a situation where Australia is one of the largest gas exporters in the world. We're one of the top 3. The money that the Australian government and the Australian people get from that level of export is an absolute pittance compared to the other 2 top gas exporters internationally. Successive Australian governments have been reluctant to do anything about that. Why do you think that is?
And the opposition made it a key point in the election campaign. Did that get any pick-up in the focus groups that you conducted?
No, because it was all left too late. And
but as a concept, though, because it's come up before, and it makes sense that you hold back energy for Australians, and there'll be more of it, and therefore it'll be a cheaper product.
Yeah, I mean, energy policy in this country is a mess. And I get it because I work in the renewable energy space. It's a gargantuan policy area, and you can have people who are experts in say, electricity, but they know nothing about gas. And likewise, they can be experts in gas or hydrogen, but know nothing about LPG. I think Tony Wood at the Grattan Institute is probably, in my opinion, probably the person who has the most holistic knowledge of energy. And even then, I don't think he would object to me saying he's probably got 20% information gaps that even he doesn't know. And the problem is that, and I think this is, Tanya Plibersek has developed this habit as an Environment Minister of saying we've approved all this renewable energy. It's like, well, that's just the approval. Finance hasn't been arranged, environmental protection approvals haven't happened, and in Victoria, in the Western Districts, around Ararat, all those wind farms, only 30% of the energy produced by those wind farms actually come back into the grid, because the transmission lines in this state run east to west, Gippsland to the Western Districts. And you can't it's not like a freeway where you flick a switch and it runs backwards the other way. You have to rebuild all the transmission lines. Now, Albanese's rewiring the nation, 10,000 kilometres of transmission lines, which is one of the reasons why the coalition did nuclear, to use the existing infrastructure. But they can't even get one transmission line of 180 kilometres long approved and built. It's been going on for about 7 or 8 years. So there's still another 9,820 kilometres to go after this one. So Labor are good at announcing these things, but not necessarily good at following through. And that's going to be a problem. I mean, Tony Blair himself just said recently, the energy debate in the UK will soon become a question of physics, not politics.
Talking about reform, tax reform, the last time we had, in my opinion, two leaders that were the great reformers for me, it was Hawke and Keating. And yes, I agree with you that, Hawke was the good bloke and Keating the bad cop, for want of a better word. The Labor Party now has a mandate. Do you think that Albanese one day will be a transitional leader and give Chalmers the baton to then, I suppose, have the courage to start those reforms?
Yeah, well, that's the interesting question about how these two will work together. I'm not persuaded to this point that either of them are particular risk takers, but I think Jimmy Chalmers, with the encouragement of Anthony Albanese, would take it on. But again, what you're hearing from them is not very much about taxation reform. What reform are we talking about? Alan Kohler said, I'll be very careful not to use Alan Kohler's language because you told me it doesn't resonate. It resonates with me. But he talks about not just the need for reform, but also about the need for economic growth, yep, which is part of the same arrangement, and they are focused on that. And economic growth is driven by immigration, by and large, has been in the past. And so the trick is not just to accept that for a start, and not play the populist line on immigration, but provide the infrastructure and the housing ahead of time, so that when the immigrants arrive, then the country is ready to embrace it. It's like building a housing estate and not providing the transport infrastructure. You just need to, if you're going to have immigration in largish numbers, you need to build up the infrastructure in advance.
Yeah, I mean, I think, absolutely, Hawke and Keating were great reformers, as was Howard and Costello, the GST consumption tax, which of course was the one reform that Labor tried but didn't sort of complete, option C. Was that in your time, Barrie?
Yes.
Option C?
Yep.
How did that fall over?
At the tax summit?
Yeah, option C.
Yeah, well, it fell over because the business groups went to Bob Hawke, the trade unions went to him, and the social services groups went to him and said they didn't want it. And Keating was on the right track, but he then went to Keating and said it's not going to happen. And that was the very first time, and it was only 12 months in or something, but that was the first time that they had a bit of a fallout, and Keating realised that it wasn't going to be as easy for him as he'd hoped. But that was essentially it. There were too many interest groups ganging up on the idea of option C, and then of course by the time John Howard raised it, they were vehemently against any GST, and he got it up anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think there hasn't been any genuine reform in this country economically for 26 years, and both parties have squibbed it, and I don't get the sense that this government will be looking at it. Certainly, you know, the coalition, it would be brave and full of risk, but I think their best path to relevancy, coming off such a low base, is to put forward some reforms. I mean, I think the untaxed transfer of wealth in this country is a massive problem. It comes up in focus groups all the time, hereditary wealth, but it has to be offset by income tax cuts, because there's a lot of aspirational people out there who don't come from money, who want to get ahead, they want to buy a house, but, you know, and they've done incredibly well through just their smarts and hard work, and they're getting taxed at 50%. So how we treat that untaxed transfer of wealth, and that includes things like negative gearing and so forth. These are the big conversations we need to have.
Well, that's it for this week. This episode was made on the sovereign lands of the Wurundjeri and Burrong peoples. Our thanks to Aaron Vincent and the Wheeler Centre for hosting it in Melbourne, and to all of you for being here. We really appreciate it. Thank you.